The earth keeps secrets. And what hides beneath our feet? As much as let us try to understand, the mysteries of our history remain guarded, sealed, hidden in the dark, in places we can't reach. In history books, they guide us with certainties. The pyramids of Giza, the temples of Machu Picchu, the ruins of Rome. However, what do we really know about ancient civilizations and their achievements? We imagine, perhaps, that all our achievements came with the progress of history, that the development of civilizations happened as a straight line, clear and without deviations. But what if, beneath the surface of Europe, there are traces of something even older, something so impressive, so advanced, that it makes us question everything we thought we knew? Worlds buried beneath the earth. It is known that the ancient Egyptians built monuments with mathematical precision, that the Mesopotamians developed a written and astronomical knowledge of surprising precision. But what about the Europeans? What is there beneath the ground we tread, in the forgotten corners of caves, in the depths of land we've never seen? In Europe, with its ancient cities and castles, something is kept, something that is not should exist. Imposing, complex, hard-to-believe structures designed with precision, as if its builders possessed knowledge far ahead of their time, or even knowledge that we cannot understand today. Tunnels that stretch for kilometers, caves carved in stone, cities hidden, underground spaces where time seems to have stopped. How could these ancient civilizations, with the tools we say they had, were able to carry out such extraordinary feats? Why then are some of these discoveries still secret? Why, if prevented investigations? How can we understand these structures that seem impossible, and who was able to build or create them? These questions accompany us to this day, and as we explore the layers of time, the answer does not come easily. Some doors open, others remain closed, as if the past itself were determined to maintain its secrets. At this moment, the awakening of our curiosity is inevitable. As we dig deeper, the questions become more imposing. Who built this? And why that we hide what we find? If you've ever wondered what's hidden beneath the surface of Europe, perhaps it's time to discover it together, because what was found, many say, shouldn't exist. Let's explore what researchers discovered and why it changes everything we thought we knew about the past. Stay with us to continue this journey. What we're about to reveal is just the beginning. The mystery of the underground structures has yet to be solved. For centuries, we walked on European soil believing that it had already told everything I had to tell. Castles, cathedrals, Roman roads, medieval cities. The surface seemed known, mapped, studied. But the first shock didn't come from what was in sight. It came from what was below. And when investigators began looking down, they realized something disturbing. Europe is not just a continent historical. It is an excavated continent. The first discoveries came about almost by chance. A landslide here, infrastructure work there, a cave explored out of scientific curiosity. Instead of solid rock, corridors appeared. Instead of natural formations, straight walls appeared. Precise angles, steps, clear marks of human intervention. Structures that they seemed improvised, but planned. Thoughts, executed with method. The initial impact was one of denial. The most comfortable explanation has always been the same. Old mines, simple shelters, isolated tunnels. But as new explorations progressed, this narrative began to fail, because it wasn't a tunnel here and another one there. There were entire networks, miles of connected passages, often crossing entire regions, crossing modern borders that didn't even exist when those structures were made. Under countries such as France, Germany, Turkey, Italy, and Spain, systems underground areas so extensive that they defy conventional logic. Some tunnels they follow in an almost perfect line for dozens of kilometers. Others fork like roots, creating true labyrinths beneath the earth. And the most disturbing thing, many of them share identical patterns despite being separated by thousands of kilometers. Investigators began to notice something strange. The dimensions were similar: a height, width, shape of the walls. In many cases, the tunnels were too narrow for efficient mining and too organized for simple refuge. They didn't seem made for resource extraction, nor for temporary shelter. They seemed made for circulation, for commuting. And someone had designed underground paths, thinking to cross the continent without being seen. Science tried to answer, Geologists analyzed the rocks. Archaeologists compared tools. Engineers studied the stability of the structures. And the more analyzed, the more uncomfortable the conclusion became. In many cases, the dating indicated for periods in which, officially, human populations did not possess technology, organization, or enough time to dig it all out. Some of these tunnels date back to the Neolithic period. Others look even older. This creates a profound paradox, because we are talking about societies that, according to books, lived in small villages, with rudimentary tools, fighting daily for survival. How could these same societies have mobilized effort, knowledge, and planning to create monumental underground works? The simple answer did not come. And when the answer doesn't come, silence arises. Many of these locations were quickly closed to the public. Some classified as dangerous, others are simply forgotten, not because of lack of interest, but because of excess discomfort. Because admitting the existence of these structures is admitting that there are gaps gigantic in the official narrative of European history. And there is another detail that is rarely mentioned. Many of these tunnels show signs of prolonged use. The walls are smoothed by time and human contact. Right curves seem shaped by the constant flow of passage. It is not the work of an event isolated. It is the work of generations. As if that underground world had been inhabited, used, integrated into the daily life of a people who disappeared without leaving records clear on the surface. Why go underground? This question echoes among investigators. Fear, protection, ritual, climate catastrophes, forgotten wars, or something even more deep, linked to the very way these people understood the world? In many ancient cultures, the underground was not just a physical place. It was a symbolic space. A womb, a portal, a refuge between worlds. When we cross-reference this information, something begins to form. Not an answer definitive, but an uncomfortable sensation. The feeling that ancient Europe was not just a collection of scattered tribes, but perhaps part of a much larger civilization, connected, silent, and underground than we ever imagined. If this is true, then these structures are not just tunnels. These are traces of a conscious choice. The choice to live, move around, or shelter below the surface. And if this choice existed, we need to ask, what were they hiding from? Or what were they preserving? This is where the mystery deepens, because the further we go down, the less the story it looks linear, and the more it looks like something fragmented, buried, waiting to be remembered. And perhaps the most disturbing question is this: do these structures really exist under our feet? How many others still remain invisible, sealed, waiting for the moment sure to be found? As investigators advanced, something even more disturbing began to unfold, emerge. It was no longer just isolated tunnels or occasional passages under villages, old ones. What appeared before human eyes were entire cities beneath the earth, organized, spacious, silent, structures, places that didn't seem improvised but designed to last. Designed to shelter life. In regions of Central and Eastern Europe, excavations have revealed underground chambers connected by long, carefully aligned corridors. Some of these cameras have niches carved into the walls, as if they had been used to store objects, food, or even rest. Others open into wide spaces, almost like hidden squares, where sound echoes in a strangely controlled way. Nothing there suggests chaos. Everything suggests order. What most intrigues researchers is the engineering involved. Many of these structures, they are located in deep layers, where the soil pressure is enormous. Still, the roofs remain intact after thousands of years. There are no signs of collapse. There is no modern reinforcements. Only stone cut with precision, taking advantage of natural flaws, support angles, and geological knowledge that, officially, should not exist at that time. In some places, incredibly efficient ventilation systems have been found. Wells, vertical corridors that connect to horizontal corridors, allowing air circulation even in extreme depths. In others, drainage channels carry water in a controlled, avoiding flooding. This indicates advanced planning, indicates tests, indicates accumulated experience. You don't learn this by trying on a small scale. Learn with technical tradition. And then the uncomfortable questions arise. Who taught this? How does this knowledge was it broadcast? Why haven't we, found clear records on the surface. Why, while below the earth everything seems organized, above it, history speaks of fragmented peoples, constantly in conflict, with short life expectancy and limited resources. Something doesn't fit. Some of these underground cities have levels, overlapping layers as if had been expanded over time. This suggests continuity. They were not built once, but maintained, adapted, reused. Generations were born, and they died down there. Generations that learned to live in silence far from the open sky, in a world of stone and shadow. There are researchers who describe the sensation of entering these spaces as something deeply disturbing, not only because of the natural fear of the underground, but because of a strange impression of familiarity, as if that environment had been made for humans, not just technically, but emotionally. The height of the ceilings, the width of the corridors, the way the sound behaves, everything seems designed for the body and for the mind. In certain spots, markings on the walls do not correspond to known tools. No, they are irregular cuts, nor marks typical of primitive pickaxes. They are uniform grooves, repetitive, almost as if the stone had been shaped, not broken. This doesn't mean necessarily advanced technology in the modern sense, but indicates lost methods, ways of working with matter that are no longer part of our historical repertoire. And then, there is the question of purpose. Why build cities underground? Shelter against invasions? Climate protection? Spiritual ritual? Some researchers suggest that the underground offered thermal stability, protection against environmental extremes. Others point to cycles of ancient catastrophes, periods of intense cold, floods, instability that would have made the surface hostile. But there is also a deeper interpretation. In many ancient traditions, the underground was not just a physical refuge. It was a sacred space, a place of initiation, a symbolic womb, where transformation occurred away from direct light. Live below of the land could have been a spiritual choice, not just a practical necessity. These impossible cities challenge our notion of linear progress. They suggest that the past was neither simple nor primitive. It was complex, silent, perhaps even sophisticated in ways we don't recognize because they don't resemble our current technologies. There were no skyscrapers, no visible machines. There was knowledge embedded in the stone, to space, to the environment itself. The more you investigate, the more you realize that these structures are not exceptions. They form a pattern, an uncomfortable pattern, a pattern that points to a Europe ancient world much more connected, organized, and aware of the underground than ever we admit. And this brings us to an inevitable turning point. If these cities exist, if these tunnels connect, if this engineering was possible, then we need to ask the question that many avoid. Who really built all this? Because when a structure seems impossible, perhaps the error is not in the structure. Maybe it's in our understanding of who we were. And it is exactly this question that takes us to the next level of the mystery. There comes a point in every investigation when data stops being just curiosity scientific and become a conceptual threat. This is exactly where many researchers are silent. Because after mapping tunnels, analyzing underground cities, and confirm that these structures really exist, the question arises that no one wants answer out loud. Who built all this? Automatic response has always been comfortable. Ancient people, local communities, work collective over centuries. But the deeper you go, the less this explanation holds true. Sustains, not for lack of goodwill, but for lack of coherence. The dates don't match. The known tools do not explain the marks. The logistics simply don't work out. And when logic fails repeatedly, something more uncomfortable than error arises. The fear of admit that the model is wrong. Because accepting these structures as real requires rewriting fundamental assumptions. It requires admitting that there was large-scale organization earlier than we imagine. What happened? Transregional planning. That there was a transmission of sophisticated knowledge outside the institutions that we recognize as civilization. And this is not just a question academic. It's a deep psychological issue. Carl Jung said that human beings are more resistant to truths that shake their identity than those that threaten your body. The idea of a past more complex than the present hurts something intimate. It dismantles the narrative of continuous progress. And maybe that's why, throughout history, So many uncomfortable discoveries have been minimized, reclassified, or simply ignored. Some independent researchers have raised bold hypotheses. They talked about a civilization prior to those known, a culture that was prosperous, before great climatic events, perhaps before the end of the last ice age, a society that understood the environment in an integrated way, which did not seek to dominate the surface, but coexist with it, even below ground. This hypothesis does not require futuristic technology or external visitors. It just demands something that we rarely concede to the past: deep adaptive intelligence, knowledge transmitted orally, techniques refined over generations, strategic choices that they prioritized, survival and continuity over visible monuments. But even this idea meets with fierce resistance, because if an advanced civilization existed and disappeared, so disappearance is no exception. It's a rule, and that forces us to look at the present with different eyes. It forces you to accept that collapse is possible, that the oblivion is part of history, that what we know today may, tomorrow, become just a buried echo. There is also another, even more uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps these structures were built by a single people. Perhaps they were initiated by a culture oldest and reused, adapted and expanded by others over thousands of years. This would explain the layers, the subtle differences in style, the overlapping levels. It would explain why certain tunnels appear primitive and others refined. It would not be the work of a moment, but a continuous process. And continuous processes rarely leave simple narratives. They leave fragments, disconnected traces, and they require interpretative humility, something that is not always welcome in institutions that rely on the authority of consolidated knowledge. Interestingly, when analyzing ancient European myths, symbolic clues emerge: legends of people who lived under the hills, stories of underground kingdoms, narratives of hidden passages between worlds. For centuries, these stories were treated as fantasy. But what if they are distorted memories? Not literal reports, but memories, collective memories from a time when the underground was part of human life? Traditional archaeology tends to rigidly separate myth and fact, but Psychology Profound reminds us that myths do not appear out of nowhere. They organize real experiences in symbolic language, and when symbols are repeated for millennia, perhaps they are pointing to something lived, not just imagined. So we return to the forbidden question: who built this? The honest answer is, no, we know. And this ignorance is not a failure. It's an invitation. An invitation to abandon easy certainties and enter a more complex, more human, more truthful territory. Because perhaps the error is not in looking for a specific builder, but in assuming that the story needs unique protagonists. Perhaps these structures are the result of a collective intelligence distributed over time, an accumulated legacy, an inheritance silent that crossed the ages without needing names engraved in stone. And if that's true, then the European underground isn't just tunnels and cities. It holds a powerful reminder. Humanity has been different before. He thought differently. He lived differently. And perhaps I chose paths that left no marks on the surface, but they survived in the darkness. This idea is not comforting. She is restless. But it also opens up a rare possibility that we still don't fully know who we are, because we still don't fully remember who we were. And that's exactly why certain doors remain closed, because some questions don't just threaten the story, they threaten identity. And in the next step of this journey, we will look at something even deeper: the echoes, spiritual and psychological, that these structures awaken, as if touching something ancient inside us. There is something curious that happens when humans enter these underground spaces, old ones. It's not just technical admiration or historical interest. It's a more sensation deep, difficult to explain. Many researchers report inner silence. Others talk about an unexpected, emotional weight, as if those structures weren't just places physical but memory triggers. Memory that does not belong to a person, but to something bigger. Carl Jung called this the collective unconscious. The idea that certain symbols, images, and experiences are etched deeply into the human psyche, inherited not biologically but symbolically. The underground is one of those universal symbols. It appears in myths, in religions, in dreams. Descending below the earth has always meant go down, inside yourself, into the unknown, to the place where transformation happens. When we look at the ancient structures beneath Europe through this lens, something changes. They stop being just tunnels and chambers and start to resemble architecture of the soul. Narrow corridors that require silence and attention, wide chambers that create echo and introspection, spaces that force the body to slow down, to feel, to listen. None of this is identity, in ancient European traditions especially. In Celtic, Germanic, and in Mediterranean times, the underworld was seen as a liminal realm, not fully alive, not completely dead, a passage space of initiation, in contact with the invisible. Entering the earth was entering another state of consciousness, and leaving it was being reborn, transformed. This leads us to a delicate question. What if these structures were not just for physical survival, but also for collective spiritual processes? And if they were temples without visible altars, places where the environment itself led to the experience interior? There are symbolic records that reinforce this hypothesis. Legends of heroes who descend to depths before returning with wisdom, of people who hide under hills sacred during times of crisis, of beings that live inside the earth and guard ancient knowledge. These myths have survived for centuries not because they were entertainment, but because they touched something real in the human experience. When Jung analyzed recurring myths, he did not ask whether they were literally true, but why did they persist, what they revealed about the human psyche. And the underground appears repeatedly as the place where truth is confronted, where the ego loses strength, where human beings find limits and paradoxically find meaning. Perhaps this is why so many researchers report feelings that are difficult to rationalize when entering in these locations. A tightness in the chest, a strange calm, a feeling of recognition. No, conscious memory, as if the body knew something that the mind forgot. How if that stone, that silence, awakened a memory too old to have words? If something inside you is awakening while listening to this, stay until the end. The answer may be here, not as information, but as recognition. This reaction is not emotional weakness. It is a sign that these spaces were built to interact with human beings in an integral way, body, mind, and spirit, different from modern architecture, which prioritizes efficiency and visibility. These structures prioritize introspection and continuity. They don't impress from a distance. They transform from inside. There is also the notion of time. Underground, time is diluted. There is no sun, no seasons visible. The external rhythm loses importance. This creates a mental state conducive to contemplation, oral transmission, deep learning. It is possible that generations have been educated in these spaces, not only in practical techniques, but in a vision of world. If this is true, then part of ancient European spirituality was not in the heavens but on earth, not on the way up, but on the way down, not in conquering the high, but in the indoor diving. This contrasts sharply with later narratives that associated progress only to verticality, to domination, to visible expansion. Perhaps these structures represent another model of civilization, a silent model, integrated, less concerned about leaving great marks and more focused on preserving continuity, memory, and balance. A model that did not survive intact but left echoes. And echoes don't disappear. They transform, reappear in dreams, symbols, concerns. Perhaps that is why, even today, talking about these structures provokes discomfort and fascination, because they remind us of something that we cannot explain but we feel. If ancestral memory exists, it does not manifest as data, but as sensation, like a subtle call, a nuisance that says, there is more here than meets the eye. And maybe the biggest mistake is to treat these constructions only as technical enigmas, when they can be, above all, testimonies of a different way of being human. And if part of who we are today still responds to these spaces, perhaps that means that the past is not dead. He's asleep, waiting to be remembered. But not every memory is welcome. And that is why, in many cases, these structures remain closed, ignored, or classified as dangerous. Not just for risk physical, but for what they can awaken. In the next step, let's face this directly, which is still sealed. What not can be explored. And most importantly, why? The further researchers advance, the more evident a disturbing truth becomes. Neither everything found can be explored. There are tunnels interrupted by bars modern. There are entrances sealed with concrete. There are areas officially classified as unstable, dangerous, or simply out of reach. But when you look at the pattern, a suspicion arises. That is difficult to ignore. Many of these closures appear unmotivated just to be safe. They seem motivated by control. In several parts of Europe, underground maps are incomplete. Records of excavations disappear. Technical reports are never published in full. Some structures are mentioned once and then disappear from the literature scientific, not because they ceased to exist, but because they stopped being discussed. How if someone had decided that certain questions should not be asked? There are independent researchers who report similar experiences in countries different. Requests denied without clear justification. Last revoked permissions hour. Areas reclassified after promising initial discoveries. When questioned, authorities respond with vague terms: geological risk, lack of funding, priority academic, but rarely with full transparency. This raises an uncomfortable question. Why so careful? If these structures are just archaeological curiosities, why not allow open, multidisciplinary studies? Continuous. Science advances with debate, not silence. And still, the silence repeat. One possible explanation is institutional. Admitting that we don't know something fundamental about the past undermines credibility. Rewriting chronologies requires reviewing entire careers, books didactic, consensus built over decades. The academic system, as any human system, resists instability, not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. But there is another, deeper layer. Whether these structures indicate an ancient civilization highly organized, adaptable, and possibly catastrophe-resilient, so they carry a dangerous message for the present. A message that says, civilizations may disappear, they can be forgotten, may leave only silent tunnels as a testimony. This idea is not comfortable, especially in a world that sees itself as the pinnacle of progress. Recognize that others came before, perhaps equally complex, perhaps more integrated into the environment, forces an uncomfortable comparison. And comparisons like that are not welcome in narratives of historical supremacy. Additionally, there is the collective psychological impact. Underground structures evoke fear, primitive, afraid of the dark, from confinement, from the unknown. They confront the illusion of control that the surface offers. Perhaps keeping certain doors closed is also a way of protecting the collective psyche from questions we still don't know how to answer. In some cases, the very physical state of these structures contributes to the mystery. Tunnels that go beyond what is mapped. Passages blocked by ancient landslides, but clearly intentional, as if someone had decided to seal access, not because abandonment, but by choice, as if certain areas had fulfilled their role and been consciously closed. This brings us to an unsettling possibility. And if part of these structures was deliberately hidden by the builders themselves, and if they knew it would arrive a time when the world above would be different, faster, noisier, less attentive. Perhaps they chose to preserve certain spaces away from the surface, away from wear and tear. Cultural, far from hasty interpretation. There are symbolic precedents for this. In several ancient traditions, the most knowledge depth was not exposed. It was guarded, transmitted only to those who were prepared. The underground in this sense would not only be physical, but symbolic. A place of containment of knowledge, not display. When we cross this with modern resistance to exploitation, a mirror emerges. Uncomfortable. Maybe we are repeating the same pattern, sealing what doesn't we understand, postponing the confrontation, keeping doors closed until there is maturity enough to cross them. But the problem with silence is that it doesn't quench curiosity. He intensifies it. Each sealed entrance becomes a symbol. Each incomplete map, a provocation. Each missing document, an amplified question. What exactly is beyond these walls? What was seen and not disclosed? What was understood and not assimilated? Some believe that it is not a single big secret, but something more subtle. One set of evidence too small to be spectacular, but too large to be ignored. Evidence that together dismantles the simple narrative of the past. And simple narratives are easy to teach. Complex narratives require silence, time, and humility. Perhaps the biggest reason to keep these structures sealed is precisely this. They don't offer ready answers. They offer deep questions, questions that require internal transformation, not just data updating. Because when we enter these spaces, we are not just archaeologists of the past. We are confronted as a species, faced with the possibility that we have already forgotten more of what we remember, that progress can be circular, of what wisdom may have been buried not by accident, but by necessity. And if that's true, then opening these doors isn't just a scientific act. It's an act existential, an invitation to review who we are, how we live, and where we are going. Maybe we're not ready yet. Maybe that's why so much remains sealed. No, because we can't physically enter, but because we still don't know what to do with what we would find inside. And it is exactly at this point that the journey approaches its end. Because when the mystery reaches the limit of what can be said, all that remains is reflection, the one that doesn't require maps nor excavations, just silence, listening, and courage. This is what awaits us in the last block. When everything is said, there is silence. Not the silence of absence, but the one that appears after a difficult truth to accommodate. The underground structures beneath the continent Europeans don't shout answers. They whisper questions. Questions that don't ask hurry, but presence. Because perhaps the biggest mistake is trying to understand them only with the mind, when they seem to speak directly to the soul. Throughout this journey, we descend layers of land, of history, of certainties. We saw tunnels that defy chronologies, cities that don't fit into narratives simple, spaces built with an intention that goes beyond immediate survival. And in the end, we realize something essential. We are not just investigating the past, we are being investigated by him. These structures remain silent, stable, real estate while the world above changes, collapses, rebuilds, empires arise and disappear, borders are redrawn, beliefs alternate, but below, the stone remains, saving old choices, keeping a way of seeing the world that didn't need to be displayed to exist. Perhaps the greatest lesson is not who built these places, but why. Why go down? Why hide? Why invest generations in something that would not be seen for the future? The answer can be simple, and at the same time, profound. Because not everything. What is essential needs to be visible. Because some truths only survive when protected. From noise. We live in a surface age, of speed, constant exposure. We measure value for what appears, for what grows, for what shines. But the underground reminds us of another logic, the root logic, what sustains without being seen, of what remains when appearance drops. Perhaps this is what these structures ask us to remember. They do not require us to accept specific theories. They don't ask us to replace a dogma on the other. They only ask for humility, the humility to admit that human. History is deeper than our summaries, that we were more than we remember, and that perhaps we chose to forget in order to continue. There's something comforting about that. If civilizations disappeared and still left traces of intelligence, care, and intention, then the end is never absolute. He is transformation, collection, seed. What was buried was not destroyed. It was preserved, waiting for the right time to be rediscovered, not necessarily with tools, but with maturity. Perhaps these structures are a mirror, a silent reminder that the real progress is not just moving forward, but knowing when to step down, when to stop, when to listen, when you accept that excessive light also blinds, and that darkness sometimes protects. And if there's anything the underground teaches us, it's that memory doesn't just live in records writings. It lives in the body, in intuition, in the strange feeling of familiarity that arises when we play something too old to be personal, as if a part of us recognized the path even without being able to explain why. Maybe that's why these discoveries are so disturbing, because they don't just ask historical review, they ask for an internal review. They ask us, in silence, what kind of civilization are we building now? One that would survive time? Or one that would disappear without leaving roots? We don't know all the answers, and we may never know. But knowing everything was never the objective. The goal has always been to remember enough, to avoid forgetting again, for honor what came before without idealizing, to walk forward without arrogance. In the end, there is the feeling that the past is not behind us. He's below, sustaining, observing, hoping that at some point we will learn to descend no out of fear but out of conscious choice. And if what we call progress is just a rootless ascent, perhaps the underground is offering us another possibility. A slower, more integrated, quieter, a path where the soul is not lost from history, nor the history is lost from the soul. If this message touched something for you, subscribe and follow us. This is not just a series of videos, it is a journey of remembrance. And maybe your soul already knows why you got this far. Because what if what we call the end is just the beginning of a memory that humanity has not yet allowed itself to recover?